So, for my presentation, I chose to do the negative effects of tourism on two different cultures, and it's by me, Sophia Masick. So, the two cultures being examined are Bali, Indonesia, and Venice, Italy, and I just have a couple facts about each. And my thesis is to examine what negative effects tourism can have on different cultures and to determine if there are any similarities between these effects and the cultures. And some essential questions, which I just thought would be important to keep in mind throughout my presentation, are: at what point does tourism become detrimental rather than beneficial to society? And how can we prevent the negative effects from arising? So, just to introduce it, I feel that although tourism offers a lot of benefits, such as boosting economic growth, creating jobs, and facilitating cultural exchange, the impacts of tourism in certain regions, such as Bali and Venice, have been very detrimental. These negative impacts can be economical, social, environmental, and cultural. So, to introduce the topic being investigated, I gave the dictionary definition of tourism, which is the act and process of spending time away from home in pursuit of recreation, relaxation, and pleasure, while making use of the commercial provision of services. So, the first culture being investigated is Bali, Indonesia, and it has a population of 4.6 million. It had over 6 million tourists, and the most predominant belief system is Balinese Hinduism. And the negative impacts of tourism are environmental degradation, economical changes, and cultural commodification. So the first one is environment, and we have overcrowding because certain areas cannot handle the large numbers of tourists, and tourism surpasses the ecological carrying capacity. Additionally, this causes increased pollution and traffic. So essentially, just over tourism is leading to just too many people, and Bali just can't sustain this amount. And then we have environmental damage because the beaches are being covered in litter. There is increased plastic waste due to littering from the tourists. And there's also habitat loss due to tourism infrastructure. So an example of this would be like deforestation to make room for another hotel or something. And then we have an excessive use of water because the tourist industry uses around 3 million liters of water per day. And I'll discuss more about this later. So, as for the cultural aspect, we have traditional ceremonies, festivals, and rituals which are becoming attractions. This changes how they're celebrated and leads to commercialization and takes away from their spiritual significance. One example of this is the Kikak dance, which is supposed to be a lengthy and complex narrative, however, it is often shortened for tourists. In this shortening, it only highlights the most visually interesting parts and causes more of a loss of their traditional practices. So this kind of gives you an idea of how their culture is being changed just to make it more interesting to the tourists, which takes away from the significance and takes it out of its original cultural context. We also have linguistic changes due to English becoming more prevalent, and we have sacred temples that are often not being respected by the tourists due to like ignorance, or they're trying to only get good pictures and not caring about anything else. And we have the economy of Bali. So we've had increase in prices that made it hard for locals to afford housing and food, and we have also outside companies which are getting money rather than the local businesses. So this causes many locals to still remain with low-paid service jobs, which thus leads to income inequality and social stratification. So essentially, these outside companies are becoming wealthier, whereas the locals are becoming like less wealthy and are staying in poverty. And we have a water inequality. So since the tourism depletes the island's water resources, it is taken away from the locals. This use of water also negatively impacts the agricultural sector, which causes more younger generations to be working in tourism industry because the water prices are too high for farming. So they can't make a profit off of farming like they used to because of how expensive the water is. And then to put this into perspective, we have 750 hectares of fertile rice fields that are sold off annually to be converted into housing and business developments. So, like, even rice fields that could have been used are being sold off because there's less farmers. This shows how tourism is becoming the predominant economy within Bali, which is an issue. And then moving on to Venice specifically, we have the population is around 600,000, and we have 30 million visitors per year. Its most predominant belief system is Catholicism, and then we have the negative impacts of tourism, which are, again, the same. So we have, for the environment, there is erosion because the cruise ship tourism has increased fivefold in the past few decades, causing Venice to now be the cruise capital of Europe. These large cruise ships and excessive boat traffic in the city's canals are creating waves that are eroding the foundation of historical buildings and canals, which is, of course, very unfortunate because we're losing important archaeological sites. And there's also flooding from the Adriatic Sea, which is damaging the first floors of hundreds of buildings, and this caused a decline in the number of apartments. Some experts believe that the city might be completely underwater in less than a century due to this increase in water level. And then we have pollution because cruise ships and motorboats cause a lot of air and water pollution. And then there's also, of course, a lot of plastic pollution and littering from the tourists. And then as for waste management, because of the large number of daily visitors generating a lot of trash and waste, there is a strain on the waste disposal systems. And as you can see in these pictures, clearly there is a lot of negative effects in the environment. And for Venice's economy, we have an economic transformation because traditional artisan shops and shops for locals are becoming focused on tourists instead. And one example of this is how grocery stores are becoming takeout restaurants and bars, and there are less shopping opportunities and higher prices for the residents. So there's also it's becoming an economic monoculture, which means that one industry is dominating, and in this case it is tourism, because this can be seen in many ways. And also we have artisans that can be forced to leave their shops just because bigger companies will buy out the areas or just increase rent to the point where they can't afford it. And then we have apartments that are being changed into Airbnbs or are becoming too expensive for locals. There are also less job opportunities because employers can't afford rent in Venice either. So clearly Venice is really focused on tourism and is catering towards the tourists and not the locals. And as you can see, I have this graph right here which shows how as the number of tourists increase over the years, the number of inhabitants is decreasing steadily. And this really helps to give an idea of how there's a negative correlation between inhabitants and tourists, and how the tourist is just really negatively affecting the locals. And for their culture, we have a large loss of local character because, as I said previously, the artisan shops are disappearing and souvenir shops are becoming more widespread. And then kind of another example of this is how locally made crafts and art are being replaced by cheaper products made outside of Venice. And then most establishments are catering to tourists instead of staying authentic, so we have more culture being lost. And another example of this is the Venice Carnival, because it is becoming more for tourists instead of being a true cultural celebration. And the masks from this carnival are now mass-produced, so they are less authentic. And so, to compare these two cultures, it is clear that both cultures change due to acculturation between the tourists and the locals, and the culture is experiencing commodification, despite the two cultures being very different from each other. And then this leads to diluted traditions. Both Bali and Venice experience over-tourism, which leads to negative impacts on both the environment and local communities. And although they are on different parts of the world, they experience similar issues, which shows that tourism is a worldwide problem. Additionally, the locals are starting to protest more and are upset in both regions. And this video helps to show how the problem applies to more places than just Bali and Venice.
Is tourism destroying cities? Residents of some of the most beautiful cities around the world have been protesting against tourism. And there has been anti-tourist violence in places like Barcelona and Venice. But why? There are 4 ways that tourism can affect cities: overcrowding, pollution, bad behavior, and rising prices. Let's begin with overcrowding. Venice, a city of 60,000 people, welcomes nearly 30 million visitors a year. That's 76,000 tourists a day. Spain had 82 million visitors in 2017, with 9 million visiting Barcelona alone. There are even traffic jams climbing Mount Everest now. Overcrowding has an obvious effect on traffic, footpaths, and queues. It can also affect a city's culture and identity, like in Barcelona, where locals are complaining tourism is diluting its vibrancy and history. Tourists also bring with them pollution and waste. They consume heaps of water and food, while causing environmental damage to the destination. In Thailand, a beach has been closed to protect its coral reefs from tourists. In Indonesia, Bali's famously pristine beaches are now being swamped by garbage, and their underground water sources are being drained too quickly. The island predicts it will run out of its water supply by 2020. In Venice, cruise ships that bring thousands of tourists each day are damaging the local environment with engine pollution and water displacement. Tourism even accounts for 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions, mainly from transportation. And then there's the issue of tourists' bad behavior. There are many viral videos that show tourists behaving inappropriately, from airport check-in meltdowns and assaults on cabin crews to deliberately damaging ancient ruins. Locals in the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro are furious at drunk tourists at their infamous Ipanema beach. In Croatia, people are fed up with loud and rude tourists, so fines are being issued to those who drink alcohol in public. And Bali is even considering imposing restrictions on temples after tourists continue to climb on the holy sites or pose in swimwear. Finally, tourism causes a rise in prices, especially when it comes to short-term rentals. Like with Airbnb, an accommodation app where users can share their homes with tourists. It has grown enormously with over 5 million lodgings across 81,000 cities. But it has its downsides. Landlords in major cities make more money out of short-term leases on Airbnb, forcing local tenants to pay more. In some cities, it can raise housing prices as people look to invest in Airbnb homes. These rising prices are not just limited to Airbnb though. In Cambodia, citizens were evicted from fishing villages so that resorts could be built on the beaches. The increased cost of living is forcing residents out from some of the most beautiful cities in the world. But there is hope. Cities are starting to recognize the impacts of mass tourism and are looking to introduce measures to deal with the load. Fines for behavior are being introduced in cities all over the world. Regulations are starting to hit Airbnb, with their listings in San Francisco, Barcelona, and Paris dropping. Iceland and Greece are instituting caps on arrivals. Venice is planning to divert massive cruise liners to reduce some of the environmental damage. And growing recognition of over-tourism could push visitors into more environmentally and culturally friendly tourism, in an attempt to save some of these delicate sites for generations to come.
Alright, so this video it helps to show how this problem is, as I said before, it's very widespread, and I think it was interesting because we had a lot of different examples and they all have similar problems in a way, and it also kind of shows current events and news. So yeah.
Is tourism
sorry. Okay. And then we have solutions. So one main solution is to have sustainable tourism. So we have government initiatives to reduce the number of visitors and to help support environmental and cultural preservation. So Bali is implementing a $10 tourist tax per visitor since 2024, and Venice also has a $5 entry fee. And we have eco-friendly practices such as limiting water uses and eco lodges. And we want to also increase tourists' awareness of the fragility of the ecosystems, and to support artisanal and authentic local markets instead of buying cheap souvenirs and imported trinkets. So overall, it is clear that globalization leads to an increase in tourism, which is both positive and negative, and tourism is beneficial as it creates economic growth, development, and cultural discoveries and exchanges. However, it has to be carefully managed to promote growth while preserving and respecting the values, traditions, and heritage of the local population. Tourism also has to be sustainable to minimize damage to the environment, and governments should implement sensible measures to minimize the negative impacts of tourism in their country, such as reducing water overusage, waste, foot traffic, and overcrowding to prevent straining the local infrastructure. And so overall, it's just clear that tourism needs to be managed and not just promoted. And hopefully, as time progresses, more and more governments and countries will become aware of this and will help to find solutions to this problem. That's my presentation. These are my references for Bali and then for Venice. So I hope you learned something. So yeah, thanks.